What if the most famous lost civilization in history was never lost at all? What if Atlantis was not a single island that sank beneath the waves, but a global empire whose ruins stand on every continent, visible to anyone willing to see them? What if Plato's detailed description of an advanced society was not mythology but historical documentation of the same civilization that alternative researchers have been calling Tartaria? And what if the reason we were taught to search the oceans was to prevent us from recognizing that Atlantis is everywhere, hiding in plain sight, relabeled and reattributed to conceal the greatest truth in human history? For 2,400 years, scholars have searched for Atlantis. They have dredged ocean floors, explored island chains, proposed locations from the Mediterranean to Antarctica. They have treated Plato's account as allegory, as fiction, as philosophical metaphor. But what if Plato was simply recording what he had been told? What if his description of Atlantis, detailed and specific, matches perfectly not a sunken island but a global civilization whose architectural signature exists worldwide? The description is precise. A civilization with mastery over stone, building structures of impossible scale. A culture that worked with red, white, and black stone, creating buildings that combine these materials in specific patterns. A society with advanced water management, controlling rivers, creating artificial waterways, building sophisticated aqueducts and fountains. A people who organized cities in concentric circles, geometric layouts that optimized both function and aesthetic. An empire that spanned vast territories, unified by common architecture, shared technology, and coordinated planning. This is not mythology. This is documentation. And when we compare Plato's description to the architectural evidence scattered across every continent, when we examine the ruins that official history attributes to dozens of different unconnected civilizations, when we recognize the impossible similarities that span oceans and millennia according to the official timeline, the conclusion becomes inescapable. Atlantis was real. It was global. It was Tartaria. And it was deliberately erased. Let us begin with Plato's actual description, because most people have never read the source material. They know Atlantis from popular culture, from movies and novels and speculative documentaries. But Plato's account in the dialogues Timaeus and Critias is not vague. It is not mythological in tone. It is historical, detailed, specific. It reads like someone documenting a real place based on information passed down through Egyptian priests who preserved records of a fallen civilization. Plato describes buildings faced with three colors of stone: red, white, and black. He describes how these stones were quarried from the island itself, how they were used decoratively, how the combination created striking visual effects. This detail is oddly specific for a fictional account. Why would Plato invent such precise architectural information unless he was describing something real? Now look at Tartarian architecture worldwide. Buildings combining red brick, white marble or limestone, and black basalt or other dark stone. This three-color pattern appears in structures across Europe, Asia, the Americas. It is not random. It is a deliberate aesthetic choice, a design signature that transcends supposed cultural boundaries. From St. Petersburg to Chicago, from Istanbul to Melbourne, the same combination of red, white, and black stone creates the same visual language. This is not coincidence. This is inheritance from a common source. Plato describes advanced metallurgy. He mentions orichalcum, a metal that shone with red light, second only to gold in value. Scholars have dismissed this as mythological, claiming no such metal exists. But descriptions match brass, bronze alloys, or copper compounds that under certain conditions produce reddish luminescence. Tartarian buildings worldwide feature extensive metalwork. Copper domes that develop distinctive patinas. Bronze fixtures and ornamental elements. Metallic architectural details that serve both structural and aesthetic purposes. The metallurgical sophistication matches Plato's description of a civilization that mastered working with metals. Plato describes concentric circular city layouts. Rings of land and water alternating, creating natural defensive barriers and sophisticated water management. He describes bridges connecting the rings, underground passages, channels that allowed ships to navigate from outer rings to the center. This is not symbolic. This is urban planning. And when we examine historical city layouts, we find concentric patterns worldwide. Cities organized in rings. Waterways integrated into urban design. Bridges and passages creating connectivity. The same planning principles Plato attributed to Atlantis appear in Tartarian city designs globally. Most telling is Plato's description of water control. Atlantis supposedly had advanced aqueducts, fountains that flowed with both hot and cold water, sophisticated plumbing systems, and the ability to manage water resources on a massive scale. Official historians treat this as fantasy, claiming such technology did not exist in ancient times. Yet Tartarian ruins worldwide demonstrate exactly this capability. Aqueducts that rival or exceed Roman engineering. Fountain systems requiring advanced hydraulic knowledge. Plumbing infrastructure that includes hot and cold water distribution. Water management at scales that suggest industrial civilization, not primitive society. The timeline is also revealing. Plato claims Atlantis fell 9,000 years before Solon, who lived around 600 BC. This would place the catastrophe around 9,600 BC, firmly in prehistory. But what if the Egyptian priests Plato cited were using a different calendar? What if their years were not solar years but lunar cycles or seasonal counts? What if 9,000 of their time units translated to a much more recent date? Perhaps around 1700 AD? This would align Atlantis's fall with the Tartarian reset, the global catastrophe that buried cities and erased civilizations during the turn of the 18th century. When we examine the physical evidence, the architectural signature, the technological sophistication, the urban planning principles, and the global distribution, Atlantis and Tartaria are indistinguishable. They are the same. Plato was not describing a fictional island. He was documenting a real global civilization, information passed down through cultures that preserved fragments of memory after the catastrophe. The Egyptian priests he referenced may have been custodians of pre-reset knowledge, maintaining records of what the world was before the fall. Now we must examine the architecture directly, because this is where the evidence becomes overwhelming. Every continent contains structures attributed to local civilizations that share impossible similarities. Similarities that official history cannot explain without invoking coincidence so extreme it defies probability. Begin with the neoclassical style. Massive columns following specific proportions. Pediments with precise geometric ratios. Symmetrical facades. Use of domes, arches, and vaulted ceilings. Integration of sculpture and ornament following consistent design principles. This style appears simultaneously across Europe, Asia, the Americas, and even in remote locations with no supposed contact. Official history attributes it to a revival, claiming architects in the 17 and 1800s rediscovered and copied ancient Greek and Roman designs. But this explanation fails immediately. The revival was too coordinated, too sudden, too perfect. Architects worldwide supposedly decided independently to adopt identical styles at the same moment. They achieved identical levels of sophistication despite having no communication? They made identical design choices, used identical proportions, applied identical decorative elements? The probability is zero. The only logical explanation is that they were not inventing or reviving. They were continuing or restoring. Working from existing structures, from preserved knowledge, from a common source that predated supposed cultural isolation. The construction techniques reveal even more. Megalithic stone cutting with precision that modern tools struggle to replicate. Blocks fitted so tightly that blades cannot slide between them. Surfaces polished to mirror finish. transportation of multi-ton stones across distances that should be impossible with available technology. And all of this appears in cultures worldwide that supposedly had no contact, no shared knowledge, no common technological base. Either every isolated culture independently developed identical advanced stoneworking techniques, or they inherited those techniques from a predecessor. Either parallel evolution produced the same engineering solutions in dozens of disconnected societies, or a single global civilization preceded them all. The evidence overwhelmingly supports the latter. One civilization. One architectural tradition. One technological base. Global in scope. Advanced beyond what official history acknowledges. And then erased, with its ruins reattributed to create the illusion of separate unconnected developments. Water systems provide the clearest proof. Aqueducts in Rome, Carthage, Istanbul, Segovia, Mexico, Peru, all engineered using identical principles. Gradient calculations. Arch construction. Material selection. Maintenance access. The designs are not merely similar. They are functionally identical. Different cultures separated by oceans and millennia supposedly solved the same engineering problems in exactly the same ways? Or one civilization built water infrastructure globally, and local populations inherited and maintained what they found. The same pattern appears in urban planning. Grid layouts. Central squares or plazas. Radial avenues extending from central points. Integration of green spaces. Positioning of major buildings at geometric nodes. These are not universal principles that every culture discovers independently. These are specific design choices. And they repeat worldwide with suspicious consistency. As if every city was designed by the same planning authority. As if a global civilization organized its urban centers according to standard principles, and those principles survived even after the civilization fell. Even decorative elements show unity. Acanthus leaf motifs. Egg and dart moldings. Greek key patterns. Rosettes. Lions, eagles, and serpents used symbolically in identical ways. These appear in structures attributed to cultures with no supposed contact. Either artistic symbolism is hardwired into human psychology so deeply that everyone independently creates the same decorative language, or these are inherited elements from a common aesthetic tradition. A global visual language that once unified architecture worldwide. The evidence of coordinated global civilization is so obvious that its denial requires active suppression. Textbooks must avoid comparisons. Curricula must compartmentalize. Architecture students study Roman buildings separately from Incan buildings, never placing them side by side to recognize identical engineering. Art historians examine European sculpture in isolation from Asian examples, never acknowledging parallel iconography. The educational system is designed to prevent pattern recognition. To keep people from seeing that the ruins worldwide belong to one source. Now we must ask why Plato's account specifically places Atlantis beyond the Pillars of Hercules, in the Atlantic Ocean, if the civilization was actually global. This detail has sent researchers searching ocean floors for millennia. But what if the phrasing was misunderstood? What if beyond the Pillars of Hercules did not mean a specific location but rather described the extent of Atlantean power? That it extended beyond the Mediterranean, beyond the known world of Greek civilization, across the Atlantic and beyond? That it was everywhere? Plato also describes Atlantis as the ruler of islands and parts of the continent. If Atlantis was global, this makes perfect sense. It controlled islands worldwide. It ruled portions of every continent. It was not confined to one place. Its influence was planetary. And when it fell, when the catastrophe struck, ruins were left everywhere. Not concentrated in one location to be found by deep-sea exploration. Scattered globally. Visible on every shore, in every region, attributed to local civilizations to hide their unified origin. The catastrophe itself matches Plato's description. He claims Atlantis was destroyed in a single day and night of earthquakes and floods, that it sank beneath the waves. But what if the sinking was not literal submersion? What if it described burial? Cities covered by mud, by dirt, by the aftermath of seismic and climatic chaos? When we examine Tartarian ruins, we find buildings buried to their second and third stories. We find street levels that are now basements. We find architecture descending far below current ground level, suggesting massive accumulation of material in relatively short time. This is consistent with catastrophic flooding followed by rapid sediment deposition, with earthquakes that liquefied soil and buried structures, with atmospheric events that rained down debris and covered landscapes. The Tartarian reset matches Plato's description of Atlantean destruction. Not gradual decline. Not slow abandonment. Sudden cataclysmic annihilation followed by burial. And the survivors, disoriented and diminished, inherited ruins they could not understand, attributing them to gods or giants or ancient mysterious builders, never recognizing they were the remnants of their own previous civilization. The Egyptian connection Plato mentions is also significant. He claims the information came from Egyptian priests who preserved records far older than Greek civilization. Egypt is one of the few places where architectural continuity seems to stretch back genuinely deep into prehistory. What if Egypt was a fragment of Atlantis Tartaria that maintained knowledge longer than other regions? What if the priests Plato referenced were custodians of pre-reset history, maintaining libraries and records that elsewhere had been destroyed? This would explain Egyptian anomalies. The Sphinx showing water erosion suggesting far greater age than official dates. The precision of pyramid construction defying explanation with available technology. The sudden appearance of Egyptian civilization fully formed, with no gradual development from primitive to advanced. If Egypt was a remnant or colony of Atlantis Tartaria, if it preserved fragments of global knowledge after the catastrophe, then these anomalies resolve. Egypt was not the origin. It was a survivor. A keeper of memory. And that memory included awareness that a greater civilization had existed and fallen. We must also address the claim that Atlantis possessed advanced technology beyond anything in the ancient world. Plato describes automated doors, complex machinery, artificial heating and cooling, and capabilities that sound almost science fiction. Skeptics use this as proof the account is fantasy. But if Atlantis is Tartaria, if we are talking about a civilization that existed as recently as the 16 and 1700s, then advanced technology becomes plausible. We have documented evidence that Tartarian structures incorporated sophisticated technology. Electrical systems using atmospheric and earth currents. Acoustic engineering that manipulated sound for practical purposes. Architectural designs that functioned as energy collectors or transmitters. Water systems that included hot and cold distribution, pressure regulation, and automated control. If this technology existed in Tartaria, and if Tartaria is Atlantis, then Plato's descriptions are not exaggerations. They are accurate documentation of real capabilities. The global distribution also makes sense economically and logistically. A civilization capable of the engineering feats attributed to Atlantis could not remain confined to a single island. To support advanced metallurgy, you need access to diverse mineral resources. To sustain large populations, you need agricultural lands across climate zones. To develop sophisticated technology, you need knowledge exchange from diverse regions. A global empire is not just possible for such a civilization. It is necessary. Atlantis had to be everywhere to be what Plato described. Now we confront the suppression. Why has the Atlantis-Tartaria connection been hidden? Why does mainstream archaeology insist Atlantis is myth while simultaneously refusing to acknowledge Tartarian ruins as a unified global civilization? Because admitting the connection means admitting that a more advanced predecessor existed. That our civilizations are not the pinnacle of human achievement but diminished survivors. That we live in a world built by someone else, someone greater, and we have been scavenging their ruins for centuries while pretending we built everything ourselves. The ego wound is too severe. The historical narrative too dependent on progressive development from primitive to modern. If Atlantis Tartaria existed, if a global advanced civilization thrived and fell, then history is not linear progress. It is cyclical. We rise, we fall, we rise again. And that means everything could fall again. Our technology, our cities, our knowledge, all vulnerable to the same catastrophic forces that destroyed the previous iteration. Institutions cannot admit this. Governments cannot allow populations to believe that civilization is fragile, that collapses happen, that the current order is temporary. So Atlantis remains mythology. Tartaria remains fringe conspiracy. And the architectural evidence remains compartmentalized, attributed to dozens of different unconnected cultures, studied in isolation to prevent anyone from assembling the complete picture. But the picture exists. Plato drew it. The ruins preserve it. And once you see it, once you recognize that Atlantis and Tartaria are the same, that the global civilization Plato described is the global civilization whose ruins cover the earth, the suppression becomes transparent. They are not hiding mythology. They are hiding history. Real history. Our history. The history of who we were before the reset, before the catastrophe, before the fall. When we examine the timeline more carefully, additional connections emerge. Plato lived in the 4th century BC. He claimed to be relating information that was already ancient in Egyptian records. But what if the information was more recent than the Egyptians claimed? What if they backdated it deliberately, placing the catastrophe in deep prehistory to make it seem mythical, to prevent the recognition that it was recent enough that evidence survived? This is a pattern we see repeatedly in official history. Events are pushed back in time to create distance. Recent catastrophes become ancient myths. Real occurrences become allegories. By the time information filters through layers of interpretation and chronological distortion, truth becomes unrecognizable as such. Perhaps the Egyptian priests did this deliberately. Perhaps they knew the catastrophe was recent, knew the ruins were everywhere, and chose to frame the information as distant legend to protect the knowledge while preventing panic or revolution. Or perhaps Plato himself, writing in a time when the reset had already occurred and memories were fading, interpreted the information he received through the lens of available chronology. If Egyptian records spoke of 9,000 time units, he may have assumed solar years when they meant something else. The confusion is understandable. But the result is that researchers have searched for Atlantis in the wrong time period, looking for prehistory when they should have been examining the 1700s. Some researchers have proposed that Atlantis was Antarctica, now frozen and buried under ice. They point to ancient maps showing Antarctic coastlines before glaciation. But this too may be misdirection. Antarctica may have Atlantean Tartarian ruins. It may have been part of the global civilization. But it was not the center. The center was everywhere. Atlantis was not a single capital city on one landmass. It was a network. A global infrastructure. An empire that treated the entire planet as its territory. When we combine all the evidence, architectural similarity across continents, technological sophistication in unexpected places, urban planning principles applied globally, Plato's detailed descriptions matching Tartarian characteristics, the timeline compressed to recent catastrophe, Egyptian preservation of pre-reset knowledge, the conclusion is unavoidable. Atlantis was not in the ocean. It was not a single island. It was not mythology. It was Tartaria. A real global civilization. Advanced beyond what we acknowledge. Destroyed catastrophically. And then systematically erased from official history through reattribution, compartmentalization, and deliberate suppression. The ruins stand everywhere. Labeled Greek, Roman, Byzantine, Moorish, colonial. Attributed to cultures that supposedly developed independently. But the architectural DNA is identical. The engineering is uniform. The aesthetic is shared. This is not convergent evolution. This is inheritance. We are living among the remains of Atlantis. We always have been. And the reason we were told to search the ocean floor was to keep us from recognizing that what we seek is all around us. Plato was right. Atlantis existed. It was magnificent. It was technologically sophisticated. It controlled vast territories. And it fell suddenly in catastrophic destruction. He was not describing fantasy. He was documenting reality. The reality of Tartaria. The global civilization that preceded our current fragmented world. The unified human achievement that was buried, broken, and erased to make way for the controlled history we are taught. But the truth survives. In the ruins that stand despite efforts to obscure their meaning. In Plato's text, preserved through millennia despite being dismissed as fiction. In the architectural patterns that repeat across continents despite official claims of isolation. In the engineering that defies attributed timelines. In the global signatures that prove coordination, unity, and common source. Atlantis was not lost. It was relabeled. It was not in the ocean. It was everywhere. And it was not mythology. It was Tartaria. The civilization we forgot. The achievement we buried. The truth that stands waiting, in stone and symmetry, for the generation willing to recognize what has always been visible. The evidence is everywhere. Literally. All we had to do was stop searching the sea and start examining the land.